During the Renaissance, the role of women in society became more noticeable and important. Their access to education and ability to read and write shaped their personal growth and opportunities. Women's visibility in public life, such as in arts, work, or social activities, reflected how they could participate in the wider society. Looking at all these aspects together helps us understand how women lived, learned, and contributed during this period. The Renaissance was a time of great change, but for women, life was still centered on the home and family. The status of a woman was mostly defined by her roles as a wife and a mother. This status was often complicated. Society put high value on women's domestic duties. The law and many writers gave them little power in the public world. For a woman, marriage was the most important event in her life. It was often a business contract between two families, not just a matter of love. A historian of the time, Margaret King, says that women in this era were largely under male control. First their fathers and then their husbands. King states that marriage made a woman an official member of her husband's family, and this new identity was her main social role. Her most important job was to manage the household and, crucially, to have children, especially male heirs. This meant that motherhood was perhaps the most respected status a woman could achieve. If a woman had sons, her position in the family was secure and honored. A woman's legal status during the Renaissance was often influenced by her marital status. Unmarried women, married women, and widows each faced different legal challenges, with many lacking full autonomy and rights over poverty. Christina de Pizan, a female writer, wrote against the common idea that women were inferior. In her book, The Book of the City of Ladies, Pizan created a city where famous women from history could live safely. Pizan wrote to defend women's intelligence and moral worth against male writers who criticized them. She wrote that women were strong, capable, and good for society. This work was a powerful argument that changed the way some people thought. It proved that women were not only important for domestic duties like cooking and having babies, but also for their wisdom and strength. She defended women's honor and argued that their intelligence was equal to men's, which gave them a higher moral status in the family and in the world. In conclusion, the status of women in marriage, motherhood, and family during the Renaissance was a mix of respect and restriction. The law and social practice made women financially and legally dependent on men, but their roles as mothers who carried on the family name were highly respected. At the same time, strong female voices like Christina de Pizan's worked to raise women's moral and intellectual status. These writings gave women dignity and showed that their true worth went beyond the walls of the house.
The Renaissance was a period marked by significant social, cultural, and institutional transformation. Alongside the reorganization of knowledge and power, social hierarchies were also reshaped, particularly in relation to gender. Despite these changes, women continued to struggle for a stable and visible place within society. One of the less obvious but highly influential tools through which this struggle was shaped was sound. Sound functioned not only as an element of everyday life but also as a means of regulating urban spaces and institutional structures, deeply affecting women's visibility, agency, and self-expression. Sound played a crucial role in organizing and regulating urban spaces during the Renaissance. Authorities did not perceive sound as neutral. Rather, it was understood as something that could produce order or disorder. Public speech, music, prayer, noise, and silence all carried social meanings, and controlling these elements allowed institutions to shape behavior. Urban soundscapes were therefore regulated to reflect hierarchies of gender, class, and moral or spiritual purity. Who was allowed to speak publicly, sing, pray aloud, or remain silent directly influenced one's position within society. For women in particular, sound became a central site of control. as their voices were often associated with access, temptation, or social instability. With the expansion of institutional structures during the Renaissance, authorities increasingly recognized the need to take control of soundscapes as a method of discipline. Because sound is one of the most fundamental forms of self-expression, regulating it meant limiting autonomy. In patriarchal systems, women's voices were frequently perceived as threatening to social order, while silence was framed as a moral virtue. As a result, women's sound and their enforced silence carried different meanings depending on the institutional context in which they were placed. For nuns of higher social status, silence symbolized what MacLean describes as spiritual privilege and obedience. Their silence was not interpreted as oppression, but rather as a sign of moral superiority and closeness to God. In contrast, for Reformed sex workers, silence functioned as a tool of penance. The suppression of voice in this context symbolized repentance and a deliberate erasure of socially transgressive identity. Similarly, in conservatories established for orphaned and impoverished girls, silence was actively cultivated as part of moral education. These institutions aimed to produce respectable and virtuous femininity by disciplining the body and the voice. Religious practices and prayer rituals further reinforced this control over sound. Enclosed religious spaces encouraged solitude and isolation, separating women from the urban public square. While this individualization appeared spiritual, it simultaneously limited women's participation in social life and reinforced institutional authority. Through the regulation of sound and silence, institutions shaped women's identities, determining when they could be heard and when they were expected to disappear into silence. In this sense, soundscapes functioned as subtle yet powerful mechanisms of control during the Renaissance. By managing women's voices and silences, institutions influenced not only behavior but also visibility and social value. Although the Renaissance is often celebrated as an era of progress and transformation, the regulation of sound reveals how deeply patriarchal control continued to structure women's lives, especially within institutional spaces.
The Renaissance is often described as the rebirth of European culture and represents a major change in culture. During this period, humanist thinkers focused on personal development. However, women did not benefit equally from these intellectual opportunities. They did not have the same access to these opportunities as men. Their education was often limited by gender norms, social status, and family authority. As a result, women could only study certain subjects and under strict limits. Elite women sometimes learned Latin, studied literature, and gained basic knowledge of history, but their education was never at the same level as men's. Their main goal was to prepare women to become cultured wives, responsible mothers, and educated members of society. Public speaking, politics, and other areas in public life were usually off limits. As Leonardo Bruni writes in his book, women could study history and moral philosophy, but not politics, since it belonged to public life. Education, in his view, was meant to help women to learn things, but only in ways that society accepted, reflecting a patriarchal humanism. Despite these limitations, women were not passive. They found ways to be intellectually active through private spaces, through letters and diaries. Diaries, letters, poetry, and religious texts allowed them to study, write, and share ideas within socially acceptable places. Some women hosted gatherings for their social circle, influencing the circulation of texts and ideas beyond their families. In addition, other women took care of old books and family archives, maintaining cultural knowledge and traditions alive for the future. Brian Richardson highlights that women actively participated in copying, sharing, and archiving text. This shows that the way women were involved with books and writing depended on their social status, their family connections, and where they lived. These activities were mostly done by high-status women. Because women from lower social classes could not access books, attend gatherings, or preserve family traditions. Overall, being educated was a limited privilege for women, and only a few could take part in learning and literary activities. As Richardson notes, the women selected were often married or young and yet to be married, whereas female patrons of art and architecture tended to be widows or nuns, because they had greater freedom than married women to give commissions. This shows that social and marital status strongly influenced which women could participate in cultural and intellectual life. Moreover, women sometimes acted as patrons or sponsors of educational and literary projects by encouraging younger women to learn. Even with many limits, they found ways to act and influence intellectual life in small but important ways. Although society expected women to focus on domestic responsibilities, their involvement in learning and writing shows that women played meaningful roles in Renaissance culture, often pushing against the limits set for them. In conclusion, women's education during the Renaissance was both limited and important. Society wanted women to stay in the home and follow the rules of virtue, but women found ways to work within these limits. By learning writing and sharing knowledge through social networks, they contributed to culture and thinking in ways beyond what was expected.